Hey, what's up, everybody? What's up? I'm Harry Wilson from Limitless Minds, and I'm here with Lynn Greenberg from Pivt, and you're joining us on our live Think Big, Go Anywhere show. During the show, we interview the most inspiring people on how the right mindset and strategies have allowed them to live purposefully and limitlessly anywhere. We invite and encourage you all to listen, but also comment or ask ask a question as we speak, and just contribute. Right? This is kind of a conversation, a think tank, and so love to hear from those that are there today. We have an awesome episode. Michael Slaby is on. He's a great friend of Lynn's, a new friend of mine. I'm really excited for everybody to get to know Michael.
Thank you. Yeah, Michael is phenomenal. He is a world leader in digital strategy and technology and how they drive organizations and companies. He is a chief strategy officer at Harmony Labs, which is working on accelerating media reform and transformation. Previously, he founded and was the head of mission at Timshell, a social impact technology company. He was a fellow at Shorenstein Center at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. He also helped lead Obama for America campaign as the chief integration officer in 2012, where he oversaw all analytics, and as deputy digital director and chief technology officer in 2008. We all know how that has changed politics as we know it today. Michael is also the author of For All the People, his first book on the relationship between media, technology, and our civic life, which we'll get to. And he's also an advisor and board member to initiatives including the United Nations, US State Department, I Am ALS, RISE, Bright Pink, I Am That Girl, and Live Strong. He was recently named to Crain's Chicago 40 Under 40 and Tech 50. So with that, all overdue, we are so excited to introduce Michael Slaby.
Thanks for having me.
Joining us.
I've been looking forward to it.
Yeah, Mike. Thanks for joining. And where are you at? You said you're up in upstate New York?
I live I'm in the Hudson Valley, a couple hours north of New York City, right on the Hudson River.
All right. Well, awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining. For those that are joining us, and by the way, we have some folks that are already in the comments. Lindy
Awesome.
Chapman, Ryan Hurry, Simon John, Shaman Summon from London, and Chris Roberts from Pittsburgh. So got some action in there. Folks, please feel free to comment and ask some questions. But Michael, just for our audience, give us just a little, maybe a brief, a brief history and, a timeline about yourself and kind of how you got here and what you're up to today.
Sure. You just got sort of the resume bio. I spent most of my career working in professional politics, mostly on the campaign side. And, there's a famous joke that timing has a lot to do with the success of a rain dance. And so just given the campaigns that I worked on and sort of the nature of the historic moment of the 2008 campaign, I've gotten to sort of have a front row seat to sort of the digitization of American politics, especially on the campaign side, and how social media has transformed the way we think about civic life. And but I came to digital and technology kind of through a side door. I was raised in Washington, D.C., so I kind of grew up around politics and politicians' kids. It's kind of in the air and in the water. You kind of can't get away. It's kind of a one company town. But that gave me a perspective about sort of politics being very personal, which I think is actually, unfortunately, in America, a feature of privilege. But in a healthy democracy, politics and leadership is personal. We should feel represented by. We live in a system of self-government. We should know who represents us and have relationships with those people. And I grew up being lucky in that regard. And that gave me a particular perspective about civic life, what it meant to be of service. But I was mostly a writer. In college, I was a creative writing major and a biochem minor, which is mostly a sign that I couldn't choose between my left brain and my right brain. Thought I wanted to be a doctor. Then life changed. And so I came into technology kind of through the lens of storytelling and writing, sort of came into the early stages of my career when the internet was first becoming interactive and becoming a place where power was starting to get shared in interesting and new ways. And storytelling and who gets to tell stories is a very fundamental feature of how power works in society, how we determine a culture, how we live together, work together. And so I sort of come to technology and digital experiences through this sort of narrative lens and organizing lens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I love it. I mean, I know that you've often stated that you're obsessed with saving the world through technology, right? As I got prepared for this, and I noticed that it was interesting because, myself and our founders at our company really feel the same, really feel similarly, right? We're doing that through mindset and kind of mindset and wellness training and so on and so forth. But I was curious to get your perspective on that, and Lynn, yours as well, because I know that what you guys are doing is impacting people on a daily basis. So I'm just curious, kind of light some fire on that topic of like, how do you see that kind of this kind of this train rolling down the tracks on relative to how we can save the world through technology.
Yeah, I think that the most important part of that metaphor is the tracks. Is where who laid the tracks? Where are they going? What are they optimized for? Mm-hmm. I think what I've seen in my life and career is that technology can be an incredible enabler, an incredible tool for distributing power, for enabling participation, for the sort of greater connectivity and generativity of sort of community at scale. It can also be an incredibly divisive thing. It can be a tool for like massively exploding inequality. It can really be harmful. And I think a lot of it has to do with the nature of the incentives that work in the systems. That like when we think about technology and social media and sort of tools around information right now, one of the frustrations I think a lot of us feel is that these tools that were ostensibly about greater connectivity and making the world smaller and building empathy don't feel like they are optimized for that kind of experience. And it's because they're not. Mm-hmm. Right. And it's not, I think it's important about when we talk about sort of the role of technology and human life and sort of in humanity and human flourishing, and is that what are we optimizing for? I don't think our media systems are broken. I think they're working exactly as they're designed for the benefit of their designers. And that is a function of the nature of economics, the nature of venture capital, the nature of business models, and how those things relate to the kinds of outcomes these tools are providing in society. And after, a decade or so with some of these exponential algorithms working on and against community, we're starting to feel some of the fraying of systems that we thought implicitly were going to lead to certain kinds of generativity and community and empowerment, not explicitly designed for those things, actually putting a lot of pressure on community and society and driving us into places where I don't think any of us ever meant to be. And I don't know that the designers of the systems ever meant us to be there either. I don't think, Mark Zuckerberg was sitting around in his dorm room twisting his mustache. I think the nature of economic expectations and business model have driven design decisions at Facebook that have driven that platform and others, all of which sort of function on the same basic premise, in a particular direction that puts a lot of pressure on people. And what's good about the reality that we're in is that it's not broken. It needs to be redesigned. And redesigning the systems is really complicated. And there's economic pressure and political pressure. And these are very powerful entities now in society. But they can be redesigned. And you hear it all the time. There are people at Facebook, smart, thoughtful, dedicated people who want their tools. And this is true of other times. I don't mean to pick on Facebook. In these companies that understand how these tools work and understand how they could work better if they were allowed to, if they were encouraged to, if we were willing to be explicit about the nature of what we needed and wanted from technology, how we wanted to think about. And when it comes to mindset, like understanding the limitless potential, if we believe that the transformations coming in society are for us, not against us, not opposing us, that the things that feel uncomfortable are actually for us, our posture might change dramatically from anxiety to anticipation. We might interact with that change and those opportunities really differently, but it's scary.
Yeah.
And I think the same is true for a lot of these technology systems, that if we can be explicit about what we need, we might get what we need.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. And actually, Michael, over the holidays, I kind of took it upon myself to read some literature about social media and kind of the detriment. So I started with your book. I also read, another book called Together. And one of the things that was, so fascinating is, and you touch upon this, is that the more people spend time on social media, there actually leads to a greater sense of loneliness. And that goes to what your point is. And this everything being driven by the wrong things, right? Because consumer apps, especially those social platforms, that we all know today, Twitter, Facebook, etc., they're all driven by advertisement. And so what that means is their main KPI or measurement is how many eyeballs are on the platform and for how long can we keep them there. And the problem with that is that leads to loneliness, right? And so, as Pivt's a social media platform, I kind of said to myself, okay, well, we need to do something about this. What can we do differently, especially since we're a subscription app, right? So we don't have to rely on advertisements. And so what we're starting to implement, and I'm really excited for this going forward, is we're becoming a way station for people to get connected to the people that they know and need to know and the resources so that they can actually start doing and seeing people in real life. And so we're being really proactive about getting people outside of the app. But also, I think what's really interesting, and I'd actually be curious from your experience, relocating recently, because I know you mentioned this, that also, one of the things that I read was that volunteering is such a great way to kind of curb loneliness outside of, social networks. And it's kind of old school, right? But I know that you kind of dabbled in that as a firefighter, right? When you relocated.
Yeah, so I think it's a great question. I moved here to the Hudson Valley 4 years ago, just a little bit pre-pandemic, and from 20 years in downtown Chicago. It was a big move. I now live in a 2,000 person village. It was a big change, driven by sort of family and the need to be closer to family. And my wife's sister and her family had lived here for 10 years. And so we landed here, and we live about 2 hours north of New York City. And so there is a little bit of a weekender community here, and there's a local community, and we wanted to be locals. And so we wanted to find ways to be part of the fabric of the community quickly. And my wife and I both sort of found our way into ways to do that. And for me, I joined the volunteer fire department and became an EMT because it was a way to be helpful, something that I felt like I could be useful, something I could be good at. Something I've always been interested in. I'd mentioned in my sort of intro that I started out in the world of being interested in medicine. When I was younger, I wanted to be a trauma surgeon. And so the idea of, getting involved in EMS was something that I felt like a way I could be useful. And it ended up, I went on active duty right as the pandemic was really starting to get going. I became an active EMT in May of 2020. And the timing on that was challenging and a little, sort of a little scary and a little uncertain, and no one really knew what was going on. But it was a way to feel useful and a way to feel like in the midst of something that felt way bigger than me, that I could do something productive. And it did give me a sense of value, and it gave me a sense of connectedness in a moment where we started to really disconnect from each other, and where we hadn't been here that long. If we hadn't had some mechanisms to sort of enable us to feel part of the fabric here, I think we would have, the pandemic might have been really hard on us because we didn't really know that many people yet. And volunteering, I think, was really essential for me in getting connected to the local community and people who've lived here for a long time. And it opened up lots of conversations that I have been really valuable for me, especially in the world of sort of politics and civic life. The 4 years that we've been in while we've been here have been really traumatic, and a lot of upheaval and a lot of things. And we live in a swing district. So one of the big changes for me moving from Chicago to here was a big shift in the type of diversity of community in which we're in. We live in a much more homogenous racial community, but a much more heterogeneous ideological community. And it's just been really powerful to be able to have community connections that are predicated on a shared sense of purpose. Mm-hmm. I think a phrase that I really lean into a lot as I think about organizing and what healthy communities look like is that if you build something, you get community. Right. Community is an outcome of doing something together of value for each other. I think sometimes it's kind of like being happy. When we try really hard to be happy, we usually fuck it up. When we try to really hard to build community, like sometimes if you just, you like build a barn or like you wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning to answer a page, you get community because it's a byproduct of caring about each other and taking care of each other. I think one thing that's tricky about volunteering is having the capacity and time to volunteer is too often a privilege.
Right.
And I think this is a place where one of the, like, and I'm sure this is something that's in your minds a lot in this conversation, I know it is at Pivt, is thinking about how work is changing and what the great pause of the pandemic has done to our assumptions about how we spend our time and where we spend our effort, and thinking very differently about our expectations for, things like, what does it mean to be fully employed? What does it mean to, in a time when communities are struggling, making time and taking time to do things like run a food bank, which is part of what some of the firefighters sort of took responsibility for in our village early on. Building a social contract and a political economy that makes that possible for everyone to fully participate in civic life.
Right.
And not just show up and vote every 4 years and then, go about your business and let us, the political class, go about governing. Like, that's not full participation. Mm-hmm. And so I think those are the kinds of questions I find myself asking, and I hear more conversation rooted in these like really fundamental assumptions about community and life and time and work and effort and meaning than I have ever seen in my life. And it is something that gives me a lot of hope about the moment we're in, even in a moment that feels a little scary and a little uncertain and a lot of anxiety. And, like, people are really over the pandemic, but 2,500 people died yesterday. Like,
yeah.
Right.
This is still, it is still happening, and it's still happening painfully to a lot of people.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. Well, we have a comment in the chat room from Simon Johns. He says,
this is a great question.
Yeah. He says,
go ahead and read it off. Yeah.
I'll read it off. He says, do you think do you think that today's digital world, the younger generation will lack in-person social skills? And do you think it's a fine line between the human touch and technology at the moment? I'm curious about this too, because I got young girls, 9, 6, and 4, right? That they're growing up in the pandemic, let alone a world that social media and social, these platforms exist. So like, not only, so it's a whole, kind of layer of social media and kind of our digital footprint. What are your thoughts on that?
Look, I think humanity is expanding in our capacity to sort of maintain relationships in new and different ways. I think where we get in trouble is when we dramatically overvalue one particular type of engagement or relationship, or misinterpret the value of one type of relationship or interaction and substitute it for something else that it's not sort of meant for necessarily. I think, building good the capacity to build relationships virtually is really powerful and valuable. Like, Harry, we just met, but we were able to like share a few minutes, and we shared some particularly personal things, not like, the deepest personal shit. I mean, we don't start there, but like starting in a place of vulnerability allows us to have a stronger conversation now, and more likely to be able to build on this relationship. But it doesn't mean we're best friends, right? I need to not misinterpret how well I know you. Right. And I think this is true, by the way, of all offline interactions too. And I think it's important that like we understand in context the value and power of different kinds of experiences to build relationships over time. And so personal direct connection builds a different kind of, it enables a different kind of connectivity. It enables a different kind of conversation. It makes certain things easier or harder. Online, like they are both valuable experiences. And I think just sort of having a knee-jerk offline is better than online or vice versa sort of limits our understanding of how these types of experiences and types of interactions can expand our community, can expand our experience, can expand our understanding of the world. And I think how we interpret them and how we assign them value is really important. And so I think, you know, for young people who are sort of native to more digital experiences, so I'm sort of in this, I'm a little too old to be a millennial, but I'm a little on the young end for Gen X, but I remember when Nirvana's Nevermind came out. So that's like and I remember when Low End Theory came out. So that, I feel like that anchors me a little bit more in Gen X, but I didn't have email until college. But I feel now like I'm very digitally native, but I didn't have that when I was sort of becoming a person and building my sense of self. And so how people in this generation incorporate this much larger access to much different stories, and a sort of one of the fundamental characteristics of the landscape we live in is it's much harder to just sort of discern culture. We have more access to more voices, which is unquestionably better. The sort of power of gatekeepers to sort of enforce a hegemony, which has traditionally been white male American cultural hegemony, is dissipating. But with that is a much harder time discerning meaning and value and truth. And I think that makes some young people are more skeptical consumers of information. They're in some ways better at understanding and discerning information, understanding sources than people like me and people who are older who take a lot of things for granted and become very easy to manipulate as a result. But I think there's also a risk that we undervalue in-person connection, that we undervalue the power of seeing each other and really seeing each other, and what kinds of communications are missed. One of the things I think we've seen a lot of as people talk about Zoom life is how tiring this kind of communication is, because we miss a lot of human communication that is nonverbal and other kinds of things that are harder to pick up in this way. And so it's tiring actually to have a more emotional connection in a time where all of those other types of connectivity aren't available to us. And so making space for the other is needed.
And what are your thoughts on the metaverse? Like, are you excited for that? Do you think it's going to be more detrimental than it is good?
I think, like most innovation, a lot will depend on the nature in which it's designed and what it's designed to achieve. If you look at who is most excited about the metaverse right now, it seems like in some ways like it's companies like Facebook who have essentially maximized the amount of profit they can get out of this economy. And the metaverse is essentially an infinite economy for them. If the same principles of maximizing inventory and attention that you described before about the nature of our current social media systems are the same design principles that we take into the metaverse, I'm concerned. I'm concerned about the nature and health of that experience. And will it be optimized to help build empathy, build bridges, help me discover and be curious about the world in ways that are both safe and challenging, to take into account my personal understanding of what is safe and what is challenging, but that help me build bridges and help me sort of engage in a world in a way that is about expansion and discovery and curiosity, and not about sort of building walls and of identity around myself because I feel like I'm under attack all the time. Mm-hmm. If the systems are built to optimize for information overload, I get worried about what kind of habits that builds in us and our ability to build bridges and build community at a distance. If it's optimized for healthy community, if it's optimized for discernment, if these things are if we have better markers for things like credibility and trust, the components of trust, like credibility and expertise and authority and intention, then I think our ability to engage in those places and understand the world accurately and clearly might actually go up. But right now we're missing a lot of those flags and tags. We relied on gatekeepers for those things for a long time culturally. And without those gatekeepers, like I said, we've gotten this like massive proliferation of voices and the explosion of voices that were previously excluded from culture. But we miss the markers and we need them. And so right now we substitute other things. We substitute things like frequency and confirmation bias and celebrity and these other pieces that don't necessarily, just because I'm verified doesn't mean I'm trustworthy. Right. Like those things aren't the same. Right. Just because I'm famous doesn't mean I know what the fuck I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. And so how do we understand who is an expert? How do we understand authoritative? And who is good at storytelling and who is authoritative aren't necessarily connected. And this is a problem we see dramatically over the last couple of years about public health information. The people who know the most about public health and epidemics and epidemiology aren't typically the best, most creative storytellers at injecting and understanding into culture.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so we see people getting information that could save their lives and the lives of people who matter to them from people who don't know what they're talking about because they're better storytellers. And this is a very super concrete consequence of media systems not being optimized for our ability to discern the world around us and to build community effectively. And unfortunately, it's costing lives.
You know, Michael, it's interesting. This is more on a personal kind of story. And so I don't know if any of my buddies are attending and watching. So
I hope so.
If they do, they'll know who they'll know what I'm talking about, not who I'm talking about, what I'm talking about. But we have this text thread, right?
Yeah.
20 guys on there from college, play sports with them. And it's a good group. Like, we love each other dearly, right? Like, I'll do anything for any one of these individuals. I don't care what their stance is on stuff, right? But politics comes up a lot, right?
Sure.
Or some iteration, some tentacle of that.
I've got my version of the same text.
Yeah. And, it's interesting because, the information that gets pulled from sources like, particularly like Twitter or whatever, right? And, I remember calling out a buddy, a good friend, and just asked him like how often, how many hours a day he spends on Twitter. And honestly, to be completely honest, it was more of a gentle jab. I'm like, hey, stop sending me Twitter stuff, right? But it was interesting, and I do the same thing, so I'm guilty of it as well. But I think what's interesting is that, some of the gospel, right, is coming from resources like, to be honest with you, like Joe Rogan, right? For example,
Sure.
Great storyteller, right?
Great storyteller. Expert
storyteller.
on MMA. Funny.
Right. Yeah.
Not an expert on everything he talks about.
Exactly. Right. And so, and naturally, as you can imagine, this particular individual, is really distrusting of, the scientists, if you will, and the doctors and so on and so forth. But Joe, as his, like it's gospel, right? And so it's really interesting to observe it, especially with a friend that I've known for 30 years, and kind of like, I'm just thinking about the aperture that's been opened up on like who's an expert, and how people.
But I think that question is super important about the whole Rogan Spotify conversation that's been going on for the last week or so is who we trust and why.
Yeah.
Right. And there's some people starting to ask some of these questions, and journalists in particular being like, why are people so willing and ready to trust sort of unauthoritative sources over authoritative sources? Like, why aren't the authoritative sources trusted? Well, what is the sort of, and look, in The Big Short, they talk about how we've lived through an era of fraud in America. And I think we're still feeling the consequences of an assumption about the separation between those who have power and those who don't, and how systems are optimized and for whose benefit. And there are assumptions about corruption in any place where there's a power differential right now. And when it comes to things like medicine, that tends to be things like, are the doctors captive to big pharma? Mm-hmm. Okay. That's a worthy question. Do I think the scientists at the CDC and the NIH are captive to big pharma? No, I don't. Do I think some of our healthcare choices as a nation get too driven by the nature of how pharmaceutical and sort of companies play in politics and how that relates to policy? Yes. Do they have more influence on public policy and health insurance, those kinds of things than they should? Probably. But asking these questions about who and why we trust who and who we trust really, really matters. And it's really at the heart, I think, of this sort of question around Rogan that I think is really worthy. And look, his casual racism has no place. Like there's no explanation for those things. There's no space for that. I want to make space for that kind of bullshit. But this question about why and who we trust matters. And is really fundamental to like how we create bridges in culture and bridges between community. And just because Rogan is not an expert on public health doesn't mean he has no right to talk about coronavirus. Right? He's commenting about what's going on in the world, and his analysis is his analysis. But how we are willing to like attach his knowledge and expertise and celebrity about one area to all areas is really problematic. How to separate those things, in the early days of social media, there was a platform called Clout that was focused on measuring influence, but it was measuring influence as like a generic concept, as if the fact that I have a whole career in like digital engagement and, online movement building, like I have a lot to say about those things. My opinions are probably valuable. I'm not always right. I'm wrong about lots of stuff, but there's a reason why I might have something useful to say there. I'm not influential about fly fishing. Like, right. and so like these kinds of things like authoritativeness isn't generic. But it's really tough in a world of information overload, in a world of infinite sources, in a world of this incredible noise. We need shorthand and we need shortcuts, and the shortcuts are hurting us. And so one of the things we need from healthier systems is better shortcuts, better markers that are meant to help us, not confuse us, not push us toward outrage, not push us toward conflict, but push us toward shared understanding of bridges, understanding blind spots. These are things that these platforms could do. They know enough about. Facebook knows what I don't see, right? Yeah. They could help me understand what I'm not seeing fairly easily, but that isn't necessarily a good business choice for them. Yeah. They're not a B Corp, right? Like, right. And so this is where if we want public goods from these things, we probably need a public declaration of principles that end up guiding how some of these things are operated. And that probably ultimately gets expressed in the form of regulation in one way or another.
Yeah. Yeah. And as you mentioned before, the algorithms, right, are showing us what we already agree with and already know. And that's creating this discourse, right? And divide. So even if the algorithms were readjusted, right, to show us some of the things that maybe we didn't agree with, or it could be really different. I
think Simon's questions are all driven by his daughter, which is awesome, by the way.
She might be in the room with him.
I strongly recommend watching Euphoria, although it will stress you out. I think this question about Facebook losing younger voters, younger people. Sorry, the day job gets in the way sometimes. Is partially a function of where growth can come from. They started in this place that was all college campuses, so they sort of their capture of community started very young, and as those users got older, their growth was in older users. Their biggest growth areas now are overseas and in older communities, because that's the only place left for them to grow. I also think because of that, you see younger people sort of fleeing the spaces where their parents are. And looking for some other types of experience that they feel like they can't get in the Blue app, right? So things like Instagram, which is also Facebook, Reels, TikTok, some of these other places that sort of offer a sort of different type of different type of experience, different type of ephemerality, are things that I think people have been sort of like striving and craving for. But I also think there is I don't want to hang out at the mall where my mom is. Like I need to be somewhere else.
Yeah.
That does play into some of the adoption.
I think people like to create these days, right? Like, these platforms that allow them to create, not only create something, but also recreate themselves, right? We're seeing that's with the Great Resignation. I like to call it the Great Reinvention, right? Everybody's just trying to.
I like that.
Pivot. No, I guess maybe pun intended. Pivot. And make those changes. You know what I mean? And
it's very on message here.
With my daughters, like, they're 9, 6, and 4. They're always creating stuff, right? I mean, we used to call that just like
childhood,
or like imagine. I'm using your imagination. That's what they're doing.
Oh.
They have a tool that they can do to like record it, right, and make stuff. So they're always doing something. It's pretty wild.
Picasso said we all children are artists. It's a question of whether we stay artists as we get older.
Yeah.
There's a lot of reasons why that gets sort of like pushed out of us.
Right. Exactly. Now I wanted to ask you, about kind of the mental health aspect of social media.
Sure.
We certainly, have seen the impact on loneliness and depression. I think, Len, you mentioned it earlier. There was a question or a comment and question in the chat room from John Chapman. He said, based on internal research from large social media companies, social networks can have a negative impact on your lives, so mental health, social community, etc. How can we make sure our online communities impact us in a positive way? And so, the question that I was going to ask that John, did a good job of kind of framing up is just, how do we leverage social media in a way that helps us improve or, build a certain level of resilience and grit and all the buzzwords that are around this area. And certainly, in our world, we're seeing this kind of boom in mental health tech, health and wellness tech. We're a part of it. But, how we're looking to try to differentiate ourselves is this kind of community meeting, a tool that can be like a daily toolkit for your mind, right? So when you're getting on the platform, just organically, you're building a level of adversity tolerance. You're building a level of language that's going to work for you, not against you, so on and so forth. But I'd be really curious to kind of get your take on like how do we kind of turn that compass around so it's guiding us in a way that's going to take us towards more of a positive yellow brick road.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is in building spaces that are meant for that, and not sort of like I was saying before. Some of the early days of sort of the early days of the internet, early days of social media were there was a sort of pervasive, like sort of cyber utopian naivety around like greater connectivity is going to inexorably lead toward healthier, more empathetic Western liberal democracy. It's like, turns out not quite true. And, I think, we're seeing data coming, out of these platforms that a lot of the habits and a lot of the experiences are really unhealthy for people. And, designing with the purpose of building resilience or building like healthier mental or giving people outlets is an opportunity to use these tools. I think one of the real questions ends up being, where does value accrue in those kinds of systems? And I think there is a lot of pressure on the way we have built community, a lot of economic pressure on the way we have built community. And it is not always the case that sort of what is best for community is what is best for profit. Like those things don't always align. In like really wonderful, carefully well-designed, mission-oriented places, you can line those things up, but it doesn't always work. And it may be the case that some of the choices that need to get made, I have a strong belief that people will exchange value and effort and time to participate in things that are good for them and good for community. And that you can build sustainable environments where there is time and energy and people helping guide the health of that community, but they may not be venture profitable. And that's a big distinction, right? Like what kinds of markets are we talking about? Are we talking about exponential, sort of hockey stick venture growth economics where 10 people get really, really rich and everybody else is sort of given the minimum possible amount? Or do we build a mental health community where the mental health providers own the community, and there's a concept of participant ownership, and the healthier the community is, everyone benefits. Everyone owns that, both patient and provider. Like that's a whole different dynamic. You're starting to optimize for really different economics, and the likelihood that you can align healthy community with those kinds of economics is higher. It's not guaranteed, but I think it is much higher than when you take sort of like the fundamental exploitation out of the equation and a particular type of expectation around profit. You see in some of the one of the most damning things that came out of the most recent sort of whistleblower data about Facebook was that their ability to handle misinformation is predicated almost entirely on users reporting something first. So they're doing nothing proactive. Once something is identified as potential misinformation or disinformation, they have the capacity to handle 5% of those reports. They made $10 billion last quarter. So the fact that they only have the capacity for 5% as a decision, there's money available in that 10 billion to take up a higher percentage of those reports. I don't know how much it takes to go from 5% to 100%. I'm very comfortable guessing it's less than $10 billion.
Yeah.
But that's not what Facebook's optimized for.
Right.
They're a publicly traded company. They have certain expectations they've got to meet. There are a bunch of other things at work. And so when you talk about mental health, some of it is about being able to sort of step back from the algorithm and not getting like eaten and consumed by the thing that's trying to maximize your attention. And then, you talked about resilience and you talked about sort of, building that capacity. Like, you don't become resilient without getting challenged, right? That doesn't mean absence of discomfort, but it means interacting and being uncomfortable in a safe and loving and kind, empathetic context in which you can be uncomfortable in order to grow, not be uncomfortable in order to scamper for safety in the form of confirmation bias or outrage or something else that's going to make you feel powerful in a situation where you have been totally disempowered.
Yeah.
And so finding spaces and creating spaces that are meant to do both. We need both. Community gives us both a sense of safety and an opportunity to be curious. We can't it's not either or. Either or is almost never the answer in these situations.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and that's why, resilience is a buzzword that we hear a lot on our side: mental toughness, resilience, grit, growth mindset.
Sure.
Right. When I'm talking to a client, customer, somebody just interested at the bar, right? I'll just try to reframe this kind of resilience.
You go to bars? What's a bar? I don't understand.
No, virtually bars.
Oh, right. Okay, got it. Sorry.
No, but
I was confused.
Well, it's like the term adversity tolerance. I may have said it earlier, right? It's because it's not it's not like the absence of adversity or challenge, right? It's really our tolerance for it. And you get a room of 10 people, everybody's going to walk in the room with a different level of tolerance.
Of course.
It's just like pain tolerance, right? I mean, we may sprain our ankle playing basketball or whatever. You may be back on the court 2 weeks later, and I'm still iced up, trying to get back on we just have a different pain tolerance, right? Same with our adversity tolerance. And so, at the corporate level, the B2B level,
and some of that's personal and some of that's cultural, right? Like, this is an important piece about community is we're not all this, like, look, one of the things we're talking about here is adversity and discomfort and safety in online spaces. I'm a cisgendered straight white male in America. I'm almost always safe. It is unacceptable for me to be the determinant of safety levels for other people, because I am the one with the most safety. Like, just culturally, historically, and so being aware of the context that people bring to an experience has to be factored in to how we build an experience that is healthy for everyone, right? To your point about sort of adversity tolerance and what is adversity? Yeah. I'm not trying to make, I love the People Supper talks a lot about brave spaces and safe spaces. And if we want people to build resilience and to experience, challenge themselves, but we got to start from a place that is not that's not so painful that the people aren't building resilience. They're just being traumatized.
Mm-hmm.
Michael, I think, so I know multiple people have asked me before, they're really curious about kind of how the Obama campaign came about in terms of why you guys decided to implement social media. And I've heard you talk about it before. I think it's fascinating. Would you mind just kind of taking a
Sure.
little bit of a step back and kind of talking about how you came about that strategy?
Yeah, I mean, look, this comes back to where I started, which is timing has to do with a lot to do with the success of a rain dance. We get credit for a lot of firsts on that campaign, and some of them, we deserve for embracing things and trying stuff. And sometimes it's just, we were the first ones to have it available. I think the reality is we had a sort of deep built-in cultural foundation that started with the president about the nature of community organizing and what it meant to build power in communities. What we then realized that we were driven toward innovation and new spaces by a political reality, which is that we were going to lose a traditional election. That a traditional Democrat, particularly the primary, a traditional Democratic primary is going to be composed of a traditional Democratic primary electorate, and that primary electorate is going to vote for a much more traditional Democratic candidate than the then senator from Illinois with the funny name that not a lot of people had ever heard of. Like, that was a big, complicated primary. There were a lot of long-term establishment Democratic candidates. And so part of what was required was take this culture that came from the president about the nature of leadership and the kind of sort of movement he thought was what civic life looked like at its healthiest and best. And then find ways to expand the nature of who is participating. And that meant new mechanisms. And that desire for, we need to go find new people, we need to involve new people, we need to enable new people to participate in new ways, that drove us to a very high tolerance for experimentation, trying new things, trying new stuff. And we were a scrappy insurgency early on. So we also were really tuned to things that were free and we could try and experiment with, right? And I remember the first time the guy on our campaign who was in charge of a lot of our early social stuff was a guy named Scott Goodstein. And he came to me, and this is when I was helping Joe Rosebars, who was our digital director, run the digital team. And we were called New Media back then because we thought it was new. I don't know. We didn't use the word digital back then. But Scott came and was like, we need to try this Twitter. Twitter is brand new. Twitter is 5 months old. And it was all SMS. There was no web interface. There were no apps. It was all text message. And I looked at Scott and I said, dude, there is just no fucking way anybody wants this many text messages from us. And he was like, it's free. It's an opportunity. I was like, okay, we can try it. But I just didn't believe it. And the good news is I listened to Scott. We tried it and he was right. And it was an opportunity in a different way of creating a different type of experience and enabling new people to be honored for their participation and create meaningful ways to be part of a movement at a distance. And it allowed us to take a sort of traditional idea about building power in communities and scale it to be able to offer more opportunities for more people to participate at a distance. And that was part of how we were able to sort of dramatically expand the electorate early on. Mm-hmm. But it was, the reality is more votes on election day than the other person. And that political desperation drove a lot of our culture of innovation.
It's amazing. It's amazing. I love it. Lynn, how much time do we have? Because we could talk for another 3 hours if you'd like.
I know. I told you ahead of time this was going to be one of those where we could, we'll certainly bring you back, Michael.
I invited myself back before we even started. So hopefully I have actually lived up to that presumption, and we just do it again.
I love it. This was really enlightening for me, and I need to get the book. Where can hey, Lynn, hold up that book again for those that are maybe just joining.
Thanks for doing that and not making me do it. You can get it wherever you get books. Bookshop.org. There's an audio version available on Audible.
Great. And people can find you ironically on social media somewhere?
They can. And my website's michaelslaby.com, points to a Substack. I do some regular writing still.
Awesome. One thing I didn't tell you, Michael, so I was also an English Lit major.
Nice.
And one of the reasons that I decided to be an English Lit major because I went to the University of Richmond, so they got a pretty awesome business school.
Go Spiders.
Yes, that's right. Go Spiders. But like in my freshman year, my English, my core, we called it core, but my English teacher pulled me aside and said, "Hey, you should like don't walk into the business school." I'm like, "What do you mean?" Like she was like, "Well, you're going to learn just as much about sales here as you will there, and you're really good at this, so just stay here." Right? She convinced me to do that, and it helped my grades, I think, because I think business school might have eaten me up. But we talked about reinvention and like the creative process, and that's something that I know from my personal experiences. I enjoy creating as well. I was a studio art minor.
Nice.
So we can definitely I can definitely have some things in common there relative to the being creative writers and learned a lot from it. So
I did a very unusual independent study in college in stone carving.
Oh wow!
Wow!
Yeah, that's great. That's awesome. I love that.
We got a lot to talk about when I come and visit on my way through town.
Yeah, come on through Louisville. We'll go get some bourbon and spend some time. Well, thank you for those who joined us. We had people really neat. We had people across the globe. It's international, if you will, and some familiar faces that have come back. So we appreciate it. And for those that are watching, look forward to seeing you in the next episode of Think Big, Go Anywhere. Michael, thanks again. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me. Good to see you.
Awesome.